Hi, and welcome back to the Online Baby Lab. My name is Klaus Libertus, and today we have a brief chat with Dr. Veronica Ramenzoni from the University of Buenos Aires, and she will talk to us about her latest research on infants' communicative gestures. However, not gestures like you might think. She talks about gestures that are actually actions. So look at this baby here that she shared with me. This baby will get a toy in front of her, and the toy is too far for the baby to reach. So the baby decides not to reach for the toy because it's too far. The baby knows there's no use in trying, I cannot get this toy. However, what happens when you put a parent or a stranger next to the baby? Now, watch this behavior. It suddenly changes to the baby actually trying to get to this toy. So what Dr. Ramenzoni said is that this suggests that the babies actually use these instrumental actions, reaching for a toy, in a communicative fashion. They are trying to communicate to their caregiver, hey, I need help with this, can you maybe get me the toy? So stay tuned for the interview with Dr. Ramenzoni, and I think it does show very nicely that our babies are pretty smart. They know how to communicate with you, they know how to get your attention, they know how to share with you that they want something. And I think there generally is more to infant behavior than we think that there is when we observe a baby doing something. They actually are trying to tell us something. So here's my brief summary, and now for the interview with Dr. Ramenzoni. Thank you so much. Today we are together with Veronica Ramenzoni from the University of Buenos Aires. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we'll be talking about an interesting new research study that you conducted about communication in 8-month-old infants.
Yeah.
You call it the social reach. Can you tell us some more about your study?
Yeah. So in general, I'm interested in how we change the way we act when we're doing actions in a social interactions within the context of a social interaction. It's an interesting problem when you think about adults. So it's not the same to move an object to give it to somebody than it is to just put it on a table. And we have quite a lot of data showing that we just act differently. And it seems to be the case that in a social task, we think about our own actions and we plan our own actions in what we call the we mode. So we take other people's actions into account. So I was interested in what will happen in infancy and how this ability will develop. In general, developmental studies tend to split up in between the people that look at motor development and perceptual development on one side, and the people that look at cognitive development as if they were two different things. What in actuality happens during development is that the body is changing very, very rapidly, and this allows the baby to start perceiving the world differently and acting in the world in different ways. So I come from a more embodied type of fieldwork, where I think that other cognitive abilities, such as the ones that are involved in planning our actions, are not separate from the development of our motor or perceptual capabilities. I chose to look at, in particular, reaching actions. So when babies reach towards objects, we know in general that any reaching action is an attempt to change the world, to make some change in the world outside. And these actions are called instrumental reaches. Now, if you want to press as I go along, we know that babies begin to reach around 4 months, and by 6 months, they're pretty confident reachers. So they do unimanual reaches, and they don't go for objects that are too far away from them. And we also know that by 8 months of age, moms often attribute communicative intentions to the baby's reaching. So the most famous case is when a baby is, putting their arms up, sort of communicating to the mom that they want to be picked up. And in general, data has shown that 87% of moms interpret these types of actions as communicating something about the world. These poses a little bit of a problem for the people studying communication, because if these reaches are not attempts to change something physical in the world, but they're trying to change something about the social environment, then they can begin to be thought of as communicative. However, we typically, when we study communication, we don't think it starts until the end of the first year of life, when we see very clear indications, such as the use of the pointing with the fingering extension. So the question I had was, well, if babies are communicating before the end of the first year, so before 12 months, is it possible that I could capture this by studying the reaching behavior? So I had two possibilities. It was either possible that babies will try to reach for objects that were outside of their motor abilities. So even though we know by 6 months they don't try to grab things that are too far away, maybe by 8 months they just revert and do it again. Or it's possible that these reaches towards objects that they know are too far away could only happen when you have a social context surrounding the baby. And this will indicate that the reaches are in some way attempting to communicate. Do you want to move on to the next slide?
So let me just briefly summarize this one. So you're
Yes.
basically saying either they will not reach for a toy because it is too far away and they know that they cannot get it, or they
Yes.
will continue to reach for the toy in the presence of another person, and this reach is
Yes.
sort of a signal, hey, I cannot get this, please help me out in this context. Okay, so we're on the next one.
Yeah, we had a fairly simple study. We had babies sitting at a table and we put objects within the reaching ability, so things they could grab, objects that were right at the limit of their action abilities, right at where their fingers could barely grab them. And we put objects quite far away, far out of their reach. And we did this in two different contexts. We did it with the baby sitting by himself or herself, and with the mom sitting next to them. But if you want to press, I think the mom should appear on the screen.
Yes, she did.
And or the dad. We did this in the Netherlands, so we had a few fathers as well. And what we looked for in particular was how many times did the baby try to reach for the object in these three different distances when the mom was there and when they were by themselves. So I'll show you a video really quickly. In the first video, you're going to see the baby sitting by herself. And first she's looking up because an adult is showing the toy. And then the toy is moved outside of her reach. This is far out of what this baby can do. Yeah, so she can't get it. And she's almost crossing her hands. So she doesn't look very interested. So if you want to move on to the next slide, we see
now the mom
the same baby, but now mom is sitting next to her. And now the baby, even though the object is too far away, is going to try to make some attempts to get it. And she's quite persistent, as you can see.
It's a very different response.
It's a very different response, and it's very clear in this baby that we more or less found the same pattern in the sample. This is a fairly small sample of about 20 babies. So I don't know how much time you want to spend with graphs. But
sure, just tell us what you found. So we see that there was, it seems like the blue bars are all higher.
Yes, it seems like when the mom is present and the object is too far out of the reach, they make more attempts to get it. When the baby is alone, and these are the green bars, and the object is outside of the reach, they try to reach for it less. In the two other conditions, when they could barely touch it and get it, and when they could potentially grab it, I mean, I have to be clear that these babies are not necessarily successful reaching. Sometimes, even though the object is really close, they try to grab it and they knock it to the floor and so on and so However, you do see them reaching less when the mom is present.
Yeah, so you
The
find
really
kind of the
interesting
opposite.
results, however, and the one we were looking for, or we hypothesized, was what will happen when the object was too far away. And indeed, we found that these babies seem to be reaching for it when the mom is there. So there is something about the presence of somebody else that makes babies want or attempt to get the object. So even though we think this initially points towards babies having some communicative intent, when we looked at their looking behavior, so how much they looked at the mom or the empty chair, we didn't find any differences. So in a classic attempt to communicate, you would expect the baby will first check on the mom and then on the object, creating something that's called a triadic relationship. And this is not what we found.
So you tried the same experiment again with somebody else than the parent, and what
Yes.
happened then?
So we did a second experiment where we had mom or somebody else. I was the somebody else. And in that case, we found the same result for the reaches. So when the object is too far away, they try to get it. If somebody's sitting next to them, it doesn't matter if it's mom or if it's stranger or somebody that they barely know. And in that study, we did find significantly more looks towards the chair. However, we really don't know if this is because they were checking whether it was somebody they didn't know or mom sitting there. But if we only look at the reaches, what we think this is indicating is that by 8 months, babies have an understanding clearly of what the reaching abilities are, so they don't try to go for objects that are too far away. But they also seem to understand that when somebody's sitting next to them, they can expand their reaching abilities by using somebody else. So by communicating, or if you please, eliciting a response on somebody else maybe giving the object to them. So we think that, sorry.
Well, basically, I think this means, so, your graph shows that they are reaching more when somebody else is sitting there than when they are alone in this far out of reach condition. And so it suggests that they understand something about the other person as being potentially helpful. Is that
Yes. So I don't know if you want to move to the last
the
slide.
discussion? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, there are two possible conclusions that you can take, stronger or weaker, depending on how you want to interpret that. In one case is indeed these babies are perceiving the social world as changing what they can do. So when I'm in a social context, now out of a sudden I can do more things. However, we really don't know if they can really understand that mom can help them. For that, we will need a control study where mom is sitting far away or is looking somewhere else, and it really doesn't show that she's.
Or she has to hold a tray, so her hands are
Or
occupied.
something. Yes. So we really don't know, but we do speculate based on the results that they seem to be planning their actions towards objects differently when somebody's sitting there. So we think this is some indication that they're thinking in this we mode that we find in adults in social interactions. The other possible conclusion of the study is that infants are communicating already with the reaching actions, even though they're not producing prototypical pointing types of gestures yet. And we think this is some indication that gesturing is not an ability that emerges out of the sudden by the end of the first year of life, but it's something that is coming along throughout development, and that it, to some extent, it might be feeding on the action repertoire the infant has, and using some of these actions initially with diversifying functions. So actions that at first could have been only instrumental, wanting to get a toy, now might be having other functions besides those. So they could have the function to communicate. However, we don't know if babies are actually intending to communicate.
So you're basically saying they are reaching, and the reaching is not an action, but it's more of a communicative gesture that they're using to initiate a
Yes.
response from their parents or their caregivers at that point.
It's possible to think about it that way.
So does that mean that our babies are extremely smart? They already know that they have the ability to change somebody else's, goals by doing these actions or gestures?
I don't know if they have the knowledge that they can actually partake on somebody else's mental states and understand, I know you have a goal and I want to give you a different goal now, give me a toy. I think this is more along the lines of we're in a social context, you're sitting here and I know when you're around me, out of the sudden, what I can do changes. Because by virtue of having you sitting next to me, I can achieve things that otherwise I could not achieve by myself. Um,
So, I mean, our babies that we typically have in our studies, and I'm going back to your video just because that illustrates what the baby is doing when the parent is there.
yeah.
They come from a home where they can reasonably expect the parent to help them out in such a situation. Do you think this would be different for babies who maybe experience some form of neglect and are not used to a adult being helpful?
I don't really think it's a function of attachment type of relations so much. However, I am curious to know what will happen if a baby is raised with a very different interaction with the environment. So you have some communities in Peru, for instance, where babies spend most of their time either in the front of the mom or in a backpack in the back, looking out. But they really don't have the same motor experience of the world around them, and they don't have the same interaction abilities by virtue of that. There is some cross-cultural data showing that pointing develops differently, so communicative abilities and other abilities really don't develop at the same time as we see in other cultures. I really wonder what will happen if we try to do a study like this with those communities, and there is actually some plan of starting that fairly soonish.
Very interesting. It's very interesting research. And I think your second experiment
Thank you.
also very nicely talks about that infants still do this with a complete stranger or somebody they've just briefly
Yes.
met. So it is not just that they expect their parents to be helpful, it's really the social context, sort of our whole socialization. Other people are helpful to me.
Yeah, and it's really hard to find babies that are not socialized, of course. So I
Luckily.
think the only way we can actually get at whether this is a social is if we look at or compare cultures that have very different rearing practices. And we see that this shapes up differently.
Just briefly, one last
Yeah,
question since you bring that up. Are we knowing anything about studies with primates in such a context? Do primates reach as a communicative intent for their caregivers?
I don't know specifically if you're thinking about reaching for distal objects, because the key here is that the object is far away, and typically in primates, you see gestures where the object is very, very, very close. So they might gesture to the mom by touching under the chin that they want to be fed, for instance. So they're not considered to be what we would call gestures.
Okay.
However, I remember some research I saw last year. I don't remember actually the author, I'm sorry, where they show that young primates might try to elicit help from a human by pulling a human and pushing them towards a lever so they can get some food, but they don't do that towards another ape. So it's only when the human caretaker is around. So I think it's an interesting question, whether we could actually train, or we do, by virtue of the type of research we do, end up training apes to take into account the human social context in a different way. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much for
Welcome.
thinking about that. So this was very interesting research. Thank you so much for joining us and for talking about this. I
Absolutely.
hope I hope you have the best of luck for your future research, and I'm curious to see
Thank
where else
you.
this is going.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. If you like this content, please subscribe and let us know in comments below if there's anything you want to know about child development that we should be covering as part of this series.